Good afternoon, and I want to thank you all for joining us today for the Florida Social Justice and Democracy Roundtable. My name is Genesis Robinson, and I have the pleasure of serving as Executive Director for Equal Ground Education Fund and Equal Ground Action Fund. We are a Black-led voting rights organization working throughout the state of Florida to ensure voting rights and civic engagement in Black communities. We're delighted to be joined by our valued partners, organizations, and allies who are steadfast in the fight for justice and equity. And a special thank you to our partners at the Florida Education Association for hosting us for this roundtable today. Today, we are here to set the record straight, to uplift the voices of Floridians who want more from their government, to ensure that our elected leaders are responsive to the needs of their constituents and center the priorities above corporate interests. For too long, we have watched as policies are crafted that ignore the real needs of our families, our communities, and our futures. And so today we are assembled in this space to speak truth to power and to deliver a message on behalf of the millions of Floridians who are demanding more from their state government. The next 60 days are not about political theater or power plays. They must be about people, the hardworking, everyday Floridians who are tired of being left behind. We are watching. We're holding legislators accountable, and we expect you to spend this session addressing the issues that actually matter and improve people's lives: economic opportunity, education, healthcare, voting rights, and criminal justice reform. Today, you will hear from organizations that represent the heartbeat of this state, each bringing the voices of the communities they serve to this conversation. And so at this time, each organization will introduce themselves and provide a response to the State of the State address, and I will get it started representing Equal Ground. So today we heard the Governor's State of the State address, and once again there was a missed opportunity, a failure to give voice to the real and urgent issues that matter to the people of Florida. Instead of offering meaningful solutions, we heard more political grandstanding, more divisive rhetoric, and more of the same misplaced priorities that have defined this administration. At a time when families are struggling to make ends meet with rising costs, when our schools are underfunded, when our democracy is under attack, and when communities are demanding action on real issues like housing, healthcare, and freedom of speech and expression, the governor chose to align himself with the policies of the past rather than the needs of the present future. Instead of leading on these critical issues, it seems that he remains fixated on a failed audition for the national stage. But the truth is that the presidential campaign is over. The national spotlight has moved on, and so it's time for us to do the same. And so, yes, while we did hear a speech today, what we did not hear from the governor was a commitment to preserving access to the ballot box, to ensuring that every Floridian, no matter their background, has a say in the future of this state. What we did not hear from the governor was an acknowledgement of the pain that so many Floridians are dealing with seniors choosing between rent and medication, families priced out of their homes due to the failing insurance crisis, workers struggling to make ends meet. What we did not hear from the governor was an assurance that he would protect Black history, culture, and diversity that makes Florida strong. We did not hear a plan to address the growing affordability crisis while ending culture wars that have dominated political discourse in the last few years. We had hoped to hear a vision for protecting our democracy, one that affirms the fundamental right of every Floridian to have a voice in the decisions that shape their lives. But instead, we got more of the same. And unfortunately, after 5 years of relentless attacks on our democratic process, passing voter suppression laws, removing duly elected officials from office, eliminating Black congressional districts through gerrymandered maps, and weaponizing law enforcement to intimidate voters and interfere in election administration, today the governor did nothing to atone for the error of those ways, nothing to make right the impact of Senate Bill 90 or Senate Bill 524, Senate Bill 7050, nothing to reject the terrible election bills that are currently making their way through the legislature this session. What we did not hear from the governor was a commitment to move pro-democracy bills like the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Florida Voting Rights Act across the finish line, a move that would not only safeguard our democracy, but pay homage to the late Senator Geraldine Thompson, a public servant who believed in access and inclusion. The role of a governor is not just a title. It carries a profound sense of responsibility that demands real leadership and commitment to serving the people. Yet nothing we heard today suggests that this governor is truly dedicated to attacking the urgent issues most pressing to Floridians. Today, the governor touted the tripling of the state's rainy day fund. Yet he fails to see that millions of Floridians stand in the rain every day. People desperately pleading for the state to deploy those resources to shield them from life's relentless storms. Whether facing the crushing weight of poverty, the skyrocketing cost of housing, or the barriers to accessing a quality health care, they are left to weather these hardships alone. While the governor celebrates fiscal reserves, countless Floridians remain without a lifeline, watching from the sideline as resources meant for the common good are locked away. True leadership is not defined by the size of a surplus, but by the courage used to uplift those most in need. So perhaps now is the time to turn away from political games and get back to the work of governing. Maybe we can finally prioritize the needs of people over personal ambition. Maybe this moment can be used to focus on real solutions instead of fueling endless culture wars. Because the challenges Floridians face are real and pressing. People need access to quality health care. They need jobs that pay a livable wage. They need an education system that uplifts every child, not just the privileged few. They need affordable housing, a justice system that actually delivers justice, and a government that listens to the voices of its people. But more importantly, the people need unfettered access to the ballot box. In a representative democracy, the vote is the most powerful tool that we have to choose the direction of our state. It is how we hold our leaders accountable, shape our communities, and demand change. And any effort to undermine that right is an attack on democracy itself. And so at this time, I'm now going to pass to our dear friend, Ms. Pamela Birch-Fort, who will speak on behalf of the Florida State Conference of the NAACP.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Genesis. Thank you to Equal Ground for hosting this opportunity for us to be here today and talk about this legislative session and respond to the governor's remarks. I am Pamela Birch-Fort. I am speaking on behalf of the NAACP. The NAACP is the oldest civil rights organization in the state. Our mission is to achieve equity, political rights, and social inclusion by advancing policies and practices that expand human and civil rights, eliminate discrimination, and accelerate the well-being, education, and economic security of Black people and all persons of color. Every organization here today shares the common focus of preserving the civil rights and liberties guaranteed to all, be it voting rights, the freedom to learn, clean air and water, safe, affordable shelter, the right to choose what happens to your own body, the freedom to love who you choose to love, to decide what your name is, and the right to basic human needs. But Florida is ground zero to some of the most vicious attacks on civil rights and liberties in the country. These aggressive attacks appear aimed at suppressing free speech and dissent and undermining democracy. And to what end? The consolidation of power. We all work in a near hostile environment. Despite a vigorous 2024 election, the Florida legislature returned without much change. The conservative supermajority continues. 85 Republicans and 35 Democrats were elected to the House, and 28 Republicans and 12 Democrats were elected to serve in the Senate. Although there have been resignations due to vacancies created with many Florida politicians now serving in the present federal administration. The power structure remains the same. The supporting cast remains the same. Our cabinet and courts remain the same. With this continued supermajority and continued supporting cast in place, I expect in many respects we will face many of the same threats we've seen in the last few years, mainly legislation that challenges constitutional truths and redefine our freedoms. While we here are all nonpartisan organizations, our ability to deliver messages to preserve freedom and secure democracy is definitely impacted and often muted in this legislative and executive environment. Today, legislative leaders appear to present an agenda of responsibility to the people, an agenda of recognizing and responding to the voices of its citizens. The governor, not so much. He seems out of step and still lost in 2020. That said, a question remains where the change is coming. Whether the Florida legislature has discovered that it is a separate and equal branch of government independent of the executive branch, or whether the legislature has simply found a new leader to follow. In any event, the Florida NAACP will remain vigilant. We will continue fighting for our freedoms. We will continue delivering our message to the legislature and to the governor of the state of Florida. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Spar. I'm an elementary music teacher from Daytona Beach and currently have the honor of serving as the president of the Florida Education Association, representing over 120,000 educators at Florida's pre-K through 12 public schools, as well as at Florida's colleges and universities. I listened to the governor's speech today, and to me, it was the same old, same old. Political line after political line, blaming, deflecting, and filled with deceit. And yet, as I'm listening to the governor, I started thinking about what I wasn't hearing. I wasn't hearing about the everyday Floridian. I wasn't hearing about parents who want the best for their children, who send their kids to their neighborhood public school to get an education so that they can have a bright future. I didn't hear the governor address the massive teacher and staff shortage that impacts literally thousands and thousands of students in the state of Florida every day. Classrooms that are filled with temporary substitute teachers instead of highly qualified, professionally trained teachers. My own daughter, who's now in 10th grade, for the first year in 4 years, finally has a full complement of teachers. She's losing out on the education that the Florida Constitution provides for, that voters in Florida continuously vote for. And yet, we have a governor who continues to ignore those challenges and continues to ignore the will of Florida's voters. In fact, the governor has a new scheme now, saying he wants to override voters by taking away the ability they have to vote to fund their public schools. It makes no sense. I think about what every American wants, what I hear from teachers and bus drivers, cafeteria workers, and paraprofessionals and office specialists and maintenance workers, the people who run our public schools every day, keep them clean, keep them safe, and make sure that every child gets an education. I hear from our university professors, our college professors, our graduate assistants, and our students throughout this state that what they want to be able to do is they want to get a great education. They want to be able to get a job that pays them well enough that they can pay their bills and go on vacation every once in a while. They want the ability to have health care they can afford that is of great quality, so when they're not feeling well, they can go to the doctor without worrying about where those co-payments are going to come from. From our educators, I hear they just want to do their job. They want to teach. I did not hear the governor talk about teaching, and I didn't hear him talk about learning either. And yet that is the main mission of public schools in the state of Florida. And they want to be able to retire with dignity after giving a whole career to our communities. It's not too much to ask for, and it is truly the American dream. So when the governor of the state of Florida is spending time trying to divide us, putting out deceitful information about diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity, making sure that our workforce looks like the people who live in our community so that people can interact. Every business wants that. DEI came from the business world. The idea that diversity meant that I was going to have people working for me who can interact with the clients that we serve. Equity, making sure that students with special needs have what they need to be successful in education. Inclusion, making sure that every child sees themselves in their learning, in their school, safe and prosperous, and that they have hope for the future. I want to know what's wrong with making sure that every child and every citizen in this state succeeds. It helps all of us. So, as I reflect on the governor's comments today, I think more about what I didn't hear than what I did.
Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Weber. I'm the Florida Policy Director for the Southern Poverty Law Center. And thank you so much to Equal Ground for your leadership in the fight for justice. And special thank you to FEA for allowing us to use this wonderful space today. At SPLC, we work to protect the rights and dignity of all Floridians. Today, I want to highlight two urgent issues affecting our communities. First, Florida's approach to homelessness is failing. Last year's passage of HB 1365, coupled with the United States Supreme Court's ruling in Grants Pass v. Johnson, have increased pressure on unhoused individuals and their families, and local governments alike. Instead of solutions, we now have policies that criminalize poverty and leave vulnerable people with nowhere to turn. Every person, housed or not, has the right to move freely, access public spaces, and receive emergency care. Yet this law forces many to live in fear, not knowing if today will bring help or harassment. Florida law enforcement officers already face real crime and safety concerns. They should not be burdened with policing people for simply existing. Jails are for those who pose a danger to others, not for families seeking a safe place to sleep. If lawmakers truly wanted to address homelessness, they would fully fund an affordable housing system under Florida's existing Housing First statute, because homelessness ends with a home, not with handcuffs. That's why we are strongly supporting HB 951, SB 1040, which clarifies the impacts of HB 1365 and ensures that unhoused individuals can move freely, access public spaces, and exercise fundamental rights like voting. But homelessness is not the only crisis we must confront. Florida continues to push Black children out of schools and into the criminal legal system. Instead of investing in real solutions that help students thrive, the state has doubled down on school policing and so-called tough love policies. The result, a well-documented school-to-prison pipeline where Black children, some as young as 7, are disciplined, arrested, and incarcerated at higher rates than their peers, even for minor infractions. Many of these children are struggling with mental health issues, and instead of receiving support, they are met with punishment. This is unacceptable. Florida must disrupt this cycle and give every child a fair chance at success. For more details, I do encourage you to read our new report. It's called Only Young Once. It's available online. You can see it, Only Young Once. But these issues, from homelessness to the criminalization of Black youth, are urgent, real, and solvable. We must demand action from the legislature and the governor as we enter this very long 60-day legislative session. Together, I am confident that we can make Florida a state where every person, no matter their background, their circumstances, or their zip code, is treated with dignity and fairness. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Amy Keith, and I am the Executive Director for Common Cause Florida, and many thanks to Equal Ground for organizing and FEA for hosting this event today. Common Cause is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to upholding the core values of American democracy and ensuring that Floridians' voices and the voices of our tens of thousands of members across the state are heard in the political process. We're looking at this legislative session as another legislative session where the people need to be represented, not big money special interests, and the people's rights need to be defended, not the political ambitions of politicians. That means protecting the people's right to vote, their right to know what their government and public officials are doing, and their right to petition their government for policies that improve their lives when out-of-touch politicians ignore the people. Any attempt to rig the rules of Florida's already extremely difficult citizen-led amendment process, like we heard proposed by the governor today, any attempt to rig these rules is an unacceptable restriction on Floridians' voices and on their fundamental freedoms. I believe I heard the government say at the start of his speech, mentioning the importance of constitutional limits on government. Well, the citizen-led amendment process is a constitutional limit on government. It is a limit on the governor and the legislator, and it's a limit that belongs to the people. Florida's citizen-led amendment process is truly by the people and for the people, and we should be doing everything we can to strengthen that process, not trying to cut everyday Floridians out of it. So we at Common Cause would encourage the governor and the legislature to instead focus more time and energy on things that help all Floridians, not things that are helping just an elite few. For example, common sense measures to support voters who've been impacted by disasters, adequate funding for our voting and election systems, support for returning citizens to even know if they are eligible to vote or not, and strengthening accountability of public officials to their constituents. And we will be fighting for the rights of the people of Florida to have access to their freedoms throughout this legislative session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Abdillah Ski, Senior Strategist at the ACLU of Florida. The American Civil Liberties Union's mission is to protect, defend, strengthen, and promote the constitutional rights and civil liberties of all people that are guaranteed by the Constitution and laws of the United States. We envision a fair and just Florida where all people are free, equal under the law, and live with dignity. We all want the same things: the ability to earn an honest living, access to affordable housing and healthcare, safer communities, quality public schools, and a democracy that works for all of us, not just some of us. But for years, Florida politicians have passed laws that are designed to erode our freedoms and limit our rights. From government censorship and abortion bans to restrictions on our freedom to vote and attacks on immigrant and LGBTQ+ communities, Florida's democracy is at a crossroads, but we are not powerless. We, the people, hold the power to shape Florida's future. And we know that what happens here in Florida doesn't stay here. Lawmakers here are setting dangerous precedents for states around the country. We are the breeding ground and testing lab for laws that are designed to roll back fundamental freedoms nationwide. Laws that suppress free speech and attack vulnerable populations like our friends and neighbors in the immigrant and LGBTQ communities. These attacks are not isolated. They're part of a larger effort to reshape our country into one where only certain voice, votes, and lives matter. But we will not back down. We are fighting in the courtrooms, in the halls of the legislature, and in our communities to protect the rights and freedoms of all Floridians. Through our collective strength and resilience, we can build the power to stand against any threat to our rights and create a truly free Florida. With the help of dedicated volunteers, community activists, and partners like the one sitting here today, we can advance the important work to preserve our rights and liberties guaranteed to all people in this country by the Constitution and laws of the United States. As I mentioned, across the country, we're witnessing a coordinated effort to erase LGBTQ people from public life. In 2024 alone, the ACLU tracked 533 anti-LGBTQ bills nationwide, of which several dozen were in Florida. And even if these bills don't become law, they do send a clear and dangerous message that some politicians don't believe that LGBTQ people belong. But we know the truth. LGBTQ people are here, they always have been, and they deserve to live openly, freely, and without fear. The same politicians and activists that are banning books are now trying to force LGBTQ people, especially transgender people, out of our communities, our schools, and our workplaces. These attacks are not about protecting anyone. They're about controlling us all. And this past election made clear that trans people are now at the forefront of these attacks. And Florida's anti-trans agenda helped create this playbook. We must name it for what it is, a political strategy of fear-mongering and scapegoating. These politicians exploit core anxieties about identity, safety, and stability to push a rigid and oppressive vision of society where only certain people belong. There also have been coordinated attacks on our freedom of speech guaranteed under the First Amendment under the Ron DeSantis' administration. We all know that Floridians deserve the right to read, learn, and speak freely without politicians deciding what they can and cannot say. Freedom of expression is a cornerstone of democracy. Everyone should be able to express themselves without fear of government retaliation. But we have seen over the last several years, whether it's the anti-protest law that was passed, the Stop Woke law that was passed, the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the First Amendment is under attack in Florida. Florida is the epicenter for these attacks and a testing ground for government censorship. Laws that restrict academic freedom, protesting rights, and press freedom are setting a dangerous precedent nationwide. Free speech doesn't mean speech only politicians agree with. It means protecting all voices, even ones that they dislike. If our children cannot learn a full and accurate history of our country, we're doomed to repeat it. Silencing protest is silencing democracy, and government censorship is an attack on freedom. The governor also mentioned the anti-immigrant law that was passed earlier this year in a special session. What he failed to mention was the $300 million in taxpayer money that are being diverted, money that could be used to improve the people's lives of Florida. And instead, it's going to aid and abet President Trump's mass deportation agenda. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and that includes our immigrant friends and neighbors. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Trish Neely, and I am the president of the Tallahassee League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a national organization, a national nonpartisan organization. We celebrated on February the 14th our 105 years strong in voting rights, and not just that, we have a pretty broad agenda where we help citizens nationwide with various issues. Within the state of Florida, there are two things that we are really focusing in on this year. One is the ballot initiative, making sure that that is protected, and the other is returning citizens. And let me be a little bit more specific about both. You know, the ballot initiative process provides the right of Floridians to propose and vote on constitutional amendments, and this has been enshrined in the Florida Constitution since 1968. Individual Floridians have this right, and it's an important one, because there are times when our legislators forget who it is that they're working for. They don't pay attention to what real citizens actually want. The citizen initiative process gives all citizens in Florida the opportunity to band together and try to pass various initiatives that are important to Floridians that perhaps their specific legislator didn't think was all that important. I heard earlier Governor DeSantis actually speak to proposing, he was floating the idea of changing the citizen initiative process. And what I had heard was that he wanted to eliminate the signature gathering campaign process. Now, that would absolutely stop citizen initiatives. Now, fortunately, that's not what I've been seeing in the Florida legislature in terms of the bills that are filed. However, it's important for all Floridians to pay attention to what's happening in their legislature, because through the years, the Florida legislature has done everything that it possibly can to try to eliminate our ability to make changes. One that I've always found amusing when I used to go to the legislature was there was one legislator, and I think he termed out, who every year wanted to change it from 60% to 67%. Well, we all know how difficult it is to hit that 60% threshold. Trying to make 67, wow. You know, that's a pretty tough push uphill. None of the reforms that have happened over the past couple of years to the citizen initiative process, which includes making it financially impossible or pretty unfeasible for average citizens to promote an amendment, but it makes it pretty easy if you're a millionaire. So that's what the reforms have done. I would really like to see our legislators turn that around and maybe say to themselves, you know what, this citizen initiative process is probably pretty good for all Floridians. Maybe we should pay attention to the good work it has done. Instead, what we hear from them is that they have to protect the Constitution. Well, the reality is, since 1968, citizens have passed 30 constitutional amendments. The lion's share of any change to the Constitution has been by the legislators or the Constitutional Revision Committee. Well, if they want to protect the Constitution, all they have to do is look in the mirror. They don't need to look toward the citizens. Now, I mentioned returning citizens because this was one of the constitutional amendments that the League of Women Voters was so proud of. And I know a lot of people that are sitting here in this room were as well. In 2018, there was a citizen initiative. 65% of Florida voters voted for it, and it was for the restoration of voting rights to returning citizens. And this included formerly incarcerated who had served their time. It was a great initiative. But rather than trying to systemically create a process for our supervisors of elections and other important officials to be able to implement that particular initiative, what the legislators did instead was add a ton of roadblocks to that particular process. This year, we're hoping that a couple of bills that will create a restoration of voting rights database will actually be voted successfully by the legislature in. You know, these are just a couple of the things that we're fighting for. And with the help of Floridians and everybody in this room, you know, we could really make a difference. But it really starts at the ballot box. And for us, making sure that all citizens have the right to vote is critical. I mean, it's part of our mission. Empower voters, defend democracy. Empower voters. And that means all voters. Not just some voters, not just the voters that those who are in office want to vote. We're talking about all voters who have the opportunity to vote. And defending democracy. You know, I've recently been so concerned because I've heard democracy is overrated. That's you know, that bodes ill in my book. We have an opportunity as a group, all of us together, to make changes that will help everyone nationwide, and particularly for those of us in Florida. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go next. Good morning. My name is Brad Ashwell. I'm the Florida State Director for All Voting is Local Action. And I guess I could really build on what Trish was just describing about democracy and voting. I mean, All Voting is Local works to eliminate discriminatory barriers to voting before they happen so that all voters can have better access. This morning, the governor touched on a lot of areas, but we didn't really hear anything about expanding access to democracy. This is unfortunate as the decisions made to shape policies on all fronts, as we've heard by other speakers, will not reflect the will of the people unless we have a vibrant democracy. And for that to exist, we have to focus on improving access to the vote. It's more important than ever that we talk about what will expand and improve democracy. For the past 5 years, we've been inundated by misinformation about fictional voting problems. Fictions about non-citizens voting, fictions about rigged voting technology, fictions about dead voters on the rolls, fictions about vote-by-mail fraud. It just goes on and on. This session, we really need lawmakers to cut through the noise and focus on what's important. Improving access to voters, empowering voters. At the end of the day, we all want or should want the same thing: smooth elections and make it easy for every voter to participate. And thankfully, there are good bills on the table. There are many practical policy changes that we could move forward on that greatly improve our elections if lawmakers can show the leadership. One bill I'd like to highlight is the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Florida Voting Rights Act. The Florida VRA, which we're calling it for shorthand, is SB 1582 by Senator Tracy Davis and HB 1409 by Representative LaVon Bracy Davis. And this bill builds on the 1965 Federal Voting Rights Act by allowing the state to step in where Congress has failed to renew important protections. It requires a review of discriminatory laws by an independent board. It creates important protections against voter intimidation. It prevents vote dilution through local redistricting and other policies. It improves language access by requiring officials to provide materials in more language and to do it uniformly. It also expands access by requiring automatic voter registration and allowing same-day voter registration. It also creates a strategic election equipment reserve for hurricanes and many other good things. This bill is real. It's there. They could hear it in committee tomorrow if they wanted to, or Thursday. We'll see if they show the will. There's several other proposals we'd really encourage lawmakers to take up, and it's discouraging that we don't hear Governor DeSantis talking about these things. Usually it's the opposite. But vote by mail has been used extensively by both major parties in Florida for decades. Voters like it. It saves resources for election officials. But in 2021, the legislature passed SB 90, which required that requests for vote by mail ballots be deleted after every general election cycle. Unfortunately, many of the concerns we expressed when the bill was passed have come to fruition. In 2020, there were 5.9 million vote-by-mail requests on file. By 2022, there were only 4.3 million. In 2024, there were only 3.5 million. So that's a roughly 19% decrease from 2022 to 2024, and a 58% drop from 2020 to 2024. This past January, several months ago, the vote-by-mail requests were all deleted again, creating a serious hardship for voters in the CD1 and CD6 special elections. A recent Herald piece noted that requests for vote-by-mail ballots had fallen nearly 90% for the CD1 special elections. In an ideal world, vote-by-mail requests would stay on file until a voter indicates they no longer wish to receive them. Instead, we would accept one small practical change that can make a huge difference this session, and that's to add a checkbox back to the vote-by-mail return envelopes where a voter can indicate that they still wish to receive a vote-by-mail ballot when they vote by that means. This is a priority for ours as well as the supervisors of elections. It would be an effective way to make sure people who like to vote by mail can easily continue to do so. We need lawmakers to bring back the checkbox to vote by mail envelopes. One last thing I'd like to highlight is practical reform relating to early voting. Early voting is incredibly popular. It's convenient. Voters can choose whatever location they want. They can go whatever time works for them. It also saves resources and reduces lines on election day. The problem is there are often areas that need an early voting site, but there isn't a location that meets the statutory requirements. The law does give supervisors of elections a little flexibility to put a site where it doesn't meet the letter of the law. But the problem is, we often have marginalized communities that don't have a site in their community that meets the letter of the law. So what we need is an expansion of what's often referred to as the wild card site, which has worked really well. This site that doesn't meet all the requirements. We think this should be expanded to 2, if not more. And again, these are just several ways in which lawmakers can easily improve elections, expand democracy in Florida for all voters. We really need election officials to ignore all the misinformation, fear tactics, and bad bills that would restrict democracy in the name of addressing fictional issues. They should work to improve the elections process and expand access to all voters.
Good afternoon. My name is Natasha Sutherland, and I'm the Deputy Director for Florida Watch. Florida Watch is a communications and research organization that keeps an eye on everything that goes on here in Tallahassee with our elected officials, and we hold them accountable. Anytime that they support laws and policies that make it harder for everyday Floridians to get ahead, to live prosperous and safe lives. In response to the governor's state of the state, I just want to emphasize that no matter what happens for the next 60 days, every Floridian should have the freedom to be healthy, prosperous, and safe. And that means real solutions for working families and seniors. And that would include things like expanding access to healthcare, bringing down the costs, raising our wages, and protecting public safety. But instead, Florida has out-of-touch politicians that are more interested in scoring political points and advancing their own political ambitions rather than solving the real issues that are impacting us every single day. They've passed laws that take away a patient's freedom to make their own healthcare decisions through one of the most extreme abortion bans in the United States. It has no workable exceptions for things like rape, incest, or even the health of the woman. It's dangerous. That ban saw overwhelming opposition when 57.2% of Florida voters approved Amendment 4. It was the one shot that we had to overturn Florida's extreme abortion ban once and for all. Instead, we saw our politicians celebrating that because it was not able to pass with the 60% threshold. I would imagine that it's not something that you as a politician would celebrate because you did everything you could to go against the overwhelming majority of your constituents and what they wanted. It's shameful. Repeal the ban. Our politicians have failed to address the insurance crisis, and our rates are going through the roof. Fix the insurance crisis. They ignore the dangers of climate change. They refuse to mitigate the impacts that raise our costs on property insurance and the costs with storm recovery, making it harder for us to put a roof over our heads. Address climate change. Working families and seniors in Florida are struggling with so many problems that impact their daily lives, and every session they go unaddressed. Our elected officials consistently put their political ambitions ahead of us, their constituents. And today, this roundtable is a reminder that y'all work for us, and you should be putting Floridians first. Florida politicians, do your jobs. Lower our costs, raise our wages, make our communities safer, and actually protect our freedoms instead of destroying them. That is how we build a brighter future for all Floridians. Thank you.
That so much, Natasha. And now we're going to pass it over to Ms. Pamela Birchford. Our friend Monet Holder could not be here today with Florida Rising, and Pamela will speak on behalf of Florida Rising.
Thank you again, Genesis. And indeed, I have the pleasure of wearing many hats, representing several of the organizations here today, organizations that care deeply about Florida and its citizens. So I'm also the strategic consultant for Florida Rising. Florida Rising is a statewide independent political organization. Our mission is to build broader multiracial movements with individuals from historically marginalized communities. We aim to win elections and campaigns at the local, state, and federal levels, with the ultimate goal of improving the lives of people in the communities we serve. We strive to develop leaders who will shift power to our communities, allowing us to shape our own destinies. Our presence spans 4 regions, serving 12 counties with 8 regional offices. So imagine, if you will, a father working 2 jobs, returning home to find an eviction notice due to missing payments, but because his rent has suddenly increased beyond his means. Picture a grandmother rooted in her community for decades, now forced to leave as developers transform her neighborhood into a luxury enclave. Envision a young couple eager to build a future, yet unable to afford a home because the down payment exceeds their annual income. Across our state, families are trapped in homes with black mold, broken HVACs, collapsing ceilings, and unsafe conditions, not because they failed, but because corporate greed and slumlords put profits over people, while lawmakers let it happen. Families should not have to decide between paying rent and putting food on the table. But this is the reality for countless Floridians today. Florida is in crisis. Over 2.4 million low-income Florida households spend more than 30% of their income on housing. More than half of these households, approximately 1.3 million, allocate over 50% of their income to housing costs. The situation is even worse and dire for Black and Brown communities. Historical and systemic inequities have led to significant economic disparities. These disparities are not coincidental, but are the result of deliberate policies and practices that continue to hinder communities of color. Today, on the first day of Florida's legislative session, we stand united to demand real solutions for Floridians, not political theater, not attacks on our communities, but bold policies that prioritize economic and housing justice. Governor Ron DeSantis and state legislators continue to side with corporate landlords, developers, and wealthy special interests, ignoring the daily struggles of millions of Floridians. Rather than investing in real solutions like rent stabilization, tenant protections, and increased affordable housing, our leaders have gutted local protections, preempted community-driven housing policies, and allowed unchecked greed to dictate where and how people live. Floridians deserve better. We will not stand by while lawmakers and our governor continue to ignore the housing and economic crises crushing working families. We're here today to say enough is enough. It is time for policies that uplift, protect, and empower Floridians, not policies that serve the wealthy and well-connected at our expense. To Governor DeSantis and the Florida legislature, if you refuse to act, we will. We will mobilize, we will organize, and we will hold you accountable at the ballot box. Let us be clear. Every person in this state deserves a safe, affordable place to call home, because Florida belongs to all of us, not just the privileged few. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone for your response to the governor's State of the State address. At this time, we will go around and hear the legislative priorities of each of the organizations assembled. I know some of you may have included that in your previous remarks, but we want to make space for you to identify your legislative priorities, and then we will close out with a collective call to action. So on behalf of Equal Ground, I want to say that, as an organization, we've been in existence now for about 5 years and 9 months at the fight to preserve and protect our democracy. But at this moment in history, we find ourselves at a crossroads, at a battle to ensure that the Florida legislature is responsive to the needs of its people. And so as we enter the 2025 legislative session, Equal Ground priorities are clear. One, we want to defeat bad election bills and restrict voting. Defeat bad election bills that restrict voting access. Two, protect our democracy from efforts to silence our communities. Three, push back against attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Black history. And lastly, advance pro-democracy legislation like the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Florida Voting Rights Act to ensure that our voices are heard at the ballot box. Florida has become a testing ground for some of the most aggressive voter suppression laws in the country. These bills are designed to make it harder for Black voters, young voters, and marginalized communities to participate. As has been stated, we saw it with the election bills that have been passed just since the 2020 election. However, we see that these attacks continue today. This year, we see Senate Bill 1414 and House Bill 1205 that aim to gut citizens' initiative process. We see Senate Bill 390, which seeks to put law enforcement in charge of ballot boxes, and unnecessary and dangerous moves aimed at intimidating voters of color. And in my opinion, one of the worst of them all, Senate Bill 1330 and House Bill 1381. A bill that imposes strict voting restrictions, including potentially eliminating student IDs as valid identification, limiting early voting days, restricting overseas voting, and expanding the governor's elections police powers. These changes disproportionately disenfranchise marginalized communities, politicize the judiciary, and burden election administrators, ultimately weakening and undermining our public trust in the electoral process. And though we're fighting voter suppression, we're also pushing forward for stronger and more inclusive democracy. And that's why we are also in support of the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Florida Voting Rights Act legislation that we hope can move in this year's legislative session. But we're not just facing attacks on voting rights. We also care about what happens this year around issues on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've seen the banning of AP African American Studies to laws that dismantle diversity programs in colleges and universities, and we're witnessing the deliberate attempt to erase Black contributions and silence our voices. These attacks are about power. They're about maintaining the status quo. They're about excluding decision-making from people who don't look a certain way. But we will not be erased. We will not be silent. And that is why we're mobilizing Black leaders, faith communities, and grassroots activists to demand that Florida lawmakers stop these attacks. This session, we will continue our commitment to having a representative of our organization here in Tallahassee every day during legislative session, to meet with lawmakers, to attend committee meetings, and to do the work of advocacy. And that's why we're proud to bring over 300 people to Tallahassee on March 26th for our day at the Capitol to directly engage with lawmakers about the issues that matter most to them. In closing, I'll say the mistakes of the past do not prevent us from doing what is right today. And we are hopeful that legislators will hear our plea, and we look forward to watching the 2025 legislative session unfold.
Genesis, the Florida NAACP looks forward to joining you on March the 26th in celebration and in honor of the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Act. That is at the top of our wish list for this legislative session and the next and the next and the next, should we need to do that. The Florida NAACP also supports the creation of a statewide database to assist returning citizens in determining whether fines and fees are owed. We support fair and affordable housing. We are advocating for the ability of our unions to expand. We support the right of Florida citizens to amend their own constitution. We advocate for increased wages. We support the freedom of expression and the freedom to read. We look forward to the reinstatement of DEI policies and Black history. And also, on the top of our list goes horizontal, not vertical. We are supporting public education. We want to ensure every K-12 public school student has the opportunity to a uniform, efficient, safe, secure, high-quality public education as required by Article 9 of our Florida Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I didn't do this earlier, and I do want to thank Equal Ground and Genesis for pulling this together. And Pamela, thank you for representing the NAACP, a true partner in the ideals that we have of a high quality, free public education for every child. And look, as I look at our priorities, one thing I've got to say is I do have hope. I have hope in the people of the state of Florida. I have hope in what I'm seeing, even in the legislature right now. The reality of it is strong public schools is a bipartisan issue. I don't care if someone is Republican or Democrat or has no party affiliation. Nearly 90% of voters in every political stratosphere believes we should have strong public schools. And so with that in mind, the Florida Education Association and its 120,000 members know that we must address the massive teacher and staff shortage. And to do that, we have to address the unfairness and the inadequacies of salary. And we have legislation right now in the legislature to do that. We have to address job security for the teachers and staff who work in our schools through multi-year contracts. The fact that young teachers who come into the profession get turned down by banks for mortgages and other loans to further their future and create and live the American dream is driven by the fact that they get a pink slip at the end of every year. We also must have transparency. You hear that a lot, but we've got to do it in a way that's meaningful. And for the searches for our university presidents, we should demand no less than that. A transparent process that allows the community, that allows the students and the professors and the stakeholders at our universities, including our alumni, to see who is in the running for the presidency and who ultimately becomes the president is important for those universities and to keep us number one in the nation. Florida's universities are among the best in the nation, and the United States universities are among the best in the world because of the great people who work there. And so politicians need to lift them up and remember that and support the work at that level. And lastly, we have to invest in our future. We have to invest in our children. We have to invest in our public schools in a real and meaningful way. And we know that it's about priorities. And we know, and I want to end with something that I heard today from the president of the Senate, President Albritton, who said today, "Hear me clearly. Our public, and I'm quoting, our public school teachers deserve to be free of needless bureaucracy. Let them teach, let them compete, so our kids win." That encapsulates what we at the Florida Education Association and what the teachers and staff and professors and graduate assistants of this state want to see. And I believe, speaking as a parent, parents want to see.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you ended on the positive note with the Senate president right there, because I too was heartened by some of the things that he said in his comments today. One thing that stuck out was a specific call out to ending childhood hunger. He said he was laser focused on ending childhood hunger in Florida. That's a major issue for us. And, the first day of session is kind of like the first day of baseball season. Everybody's going to the World Series. And I definitely have hope that this year we can always do good things if we come together, work pragmatically, and smartly advocate for our policies at the Capitol. So I do believe that today, day one. And I am going to take the Senate President at his word on childhood hunger. He also has some other items related to housing that seem very promising, and we will be closely watching as those policies develop into the budget process, which is, of course, where the rubber meets the road. But at the Southern Poverty Law Center, we do fight for eradicating poverty, defending democracy, pushing hate and extremism out of the mainstream, protecting kids' education, and reforming Florida's criminal legal system. I did get ahead of myself in my earlier comments. I apologize. But one of the bills that we are working on that will help reduce the burden on law enforcement is HB 951, SB 1040, sponsored by Representative Mitch Rosenwald and Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith, which will provide clarity to unhoused people's ability to access public services and be in public spaces. We do think that's very important to minimize the burdens on law enforcement and our incarceration system. There are a lot of other items that we're looking for, but many of them have been spoken about today, and I do looking to hear from my partners.
Thank you. So we absolutely join our partners with one of our core priorities really being expanding access to the ballot, support for the Florida Voting Rights Act, the database for returning citizens. And really one of our top priorities with respect to expanding access to the ballot this session is the disaster-affected Voter Bill of Rights, which is SB 1486, filed by Senator Polsky, and HB 1317 filed by Representative Cross. So we all know that hurricanes are becoming larger and more severe and impacting huge swaths of our state, both in the county where a storm makes landfall and in counties that may be impacted days later by flooding. And with hurricane season overlapping with election season, we regularly have major storms impacting voters in advance of elections, as we just saw with Hurricanes Helene and Milton in 2024. Now that means voters who are displaced, flooded, don't have access to power or internet or transportation, are trying to figure out how to make their voice heard in what are often major elections like last year. So this, the Disaster Affected Voter Bill of Rights, these two bills, they are about common sense. We know what measures help voters in the aftermath of a disaster because we have implemented those measures time and time again. What we need is for these measures to be implemented predictably and consistently for all voters who are affected by a disaster. These bills do that. But this is also about fairness. Access to support that voters receive after a storm should not depend on their county. It should all eligible voters in all affected counties should receive the same opportunities, information, and support to make sure that they're able to cast their ballot and make their voices heard. And these bills also do that. And that's why we are supporting the Disaster Affected Voter Bill of Rights as one of our top priorities for expanding access to the ballot in 2025. Now, another of our core priorities this year is around transparency and accountability. The people of Florida have pushed for and value transparency and accountability from their elected officials for decades, no matter which way the political winds have been blowing, all the way back to the 1970s when we, the people of Florida, passed the Sunshine Amendment to the Florida Constitution. And as a state, we have been known for having some of the best sunshine laws on the books in the United States. Unfortunately, these sunshine laws have been chipped away year after year. We have more than 1,000 public records exemptions on the books and dozens more proposed this year. And last year, we actually saw a really troubling ethics bill that rolled back accountability for public officials. So we are really glad to see two excellent bills actually this year. We have Senate Bill 1434 by Senator Roussan, would help address the problem of state, county, and local government agencies delaying, denying, or outright ignoring public records requests coming in from Floridians. That bill would help address that ongoing problem. We also have Senate Bill 352 by Senator Gates, which would help address some of the harms of last year's ethics bill by prohibiting public agencies from retaliating against employees who disclose information to the Commission on Ethics. We believe there are common sense measures that can be put in place to improve and protect accountability and transparency in the state of Florida. Secrecy cannot become the default when it comes to public officials and public records. And Common Cause will continue to advocate for transparency and accountability this year and as we have every year since way back in the 1970s with that Sunshine Amendment. Thanks.
Thank you. And I mentioned earlier that the ACLU of Florida, we focus on civil rights and civil liberties issues for the purposes of today. I'm going to go over those 3 issue areas that I mentioned in my earlier remarks: attacks on our immigrant friends and family, LGBTQ friends and family, and our free speech, attacks on our freedom to express ourselves and speak speech that the government doesn't believe in. So we will continue to challenge discriminatory laws in court, advocate for protections, and mobilize Floridians to demand justice. But I like this theme of providing solutions, real solutions that people in power can actually pass. These bills have been filed and they can be heard in committee, but they simply are not being heard. There's the Freedom to Learn Act that was filed by Senator Tracy Davis and Representative Angie Nixon that undoes a lot of the harmful legislation that the state of Florida has passed in recent years that censor classroom discussions on topics like race, on topics like gender, and really forces teachers to self-censor themselves for fear of being sued or fired. There is the Healthcare Freedom Act that was filed by Senator Chevron Jones and Representative Anna Eskamani that ensures that all Floridians, regardless of their gender, or their whether you're cisgender or transgender, that you have access to healthcare, to medically necessary healthcare. And then there's also the Florida Economic Prosperity and Immigration Act, filed by Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith and Representative Dottie Joseph, that will ensure that Florida is the welcoming state and open to our immigrant friends, families, and neighbors that we really should be, rather than scapegoating these communities for political points.
So it probably makes sense that an organization that was founded with voting rights as its number one issue, that we still treat voting rights and also election reform in every session as our number one issue. In addition to that, we allow our grassroots members statewide to vote on 3 other issues that they want the league to follow and to act upon during the session. This year, it's public education, reproductive rights, and gun violence prevention. So let me go back and just talk a little bit more about the voting rights and election reform. So with voting rights, and you've heard a lot of my advocate partners here talk about voting rights, the importance of it, and also some of the bills that they're following, and I won't repeat that. But what I will say is, with respect to election reform, and this is not a new issue for the league. I mean, we have taken positions on election reform for decades, and one of the biggest ones, and probably one of the most controversial, is that we believe strongly that the Electoral College does more harm than good. And we believe that the president and the vice president should be elected directly by all citizens and by popular vote. So any opportunity that we have to advocate for that position, we do so, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. As far as public education, we, and really the last 3 that I mentioned, public education, reproductive rights, and gun violence prevention, we realize that our expertise is really in the voting rights arena. That's been our bread and butter for years. However, we follow our advocate organizations with other issues. And often the league brings to our fellow advocate organizations, while they're the experts, we have boots on the ground. So we are extremely supportive of everybody in this room. We love what FEA is doing in the area of public education. We are always going to be a strong supporter. With respect to reproductive rights, this was a major issue for the league last year. And although we all know that Amendment 4 failed, but we also all know that 57% of Floridians voted for it. So our goal this year is to make sure that legislators remember that 50% of Floridians voted for it. And we will do whatever we can to keep that front and center. And with respect to gun violence, the one thing I heard in the governor's address, I didn't have an opportunity to hear all of it, but I did hear him say that he's very interested in a tax holiday for Second Amendment rights. Great. What I did not hear him say was anything about gun violence in our schools and how he and his administration are going to do everything possible to make sure that our school children are protected. They shouldn't have to have drills on how to, find a safe place to be in your classroom if there's a gunman present. I mean, it's really ridiculous. But anyway, that's the world that we live in right now. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about how we advocate. We have 29 locals around the state of Florida. We believe strongly that our members should be advocating for our issues, particularly our number one issue, which is voting rights and reform, year-round. So we don't just focus on the general session when the legislators are here in Tallahassee. In fact, there are some who say if you wait until general session, you probably missed the boat. So advocacy for us has got to be a year-round thing. Our members meet with their legislators in their home district, and they make sure to say, oh, by the way, I'm a constituent, to make sure that the legislator pays attention. We also, like many of the organizations here, have a day on the Hill on our Capitol. Our lobby days this year is March the 11th through the 12th, when we will have members coming from around the state to Tallahassee. They'll have an opportunity to speak directly with their legislators here, as well as what they did when they were in their home district. So that's always a good event for us. It's a day of education, training everybody on the do's and don'ts when you're doing advocacy. And again, I just want to lift up every person in this room, because without our fellow advocates, we couldn't get as much done as what we are able to do. So I want to thank you all, and definitely thank you for pulling us all together today. It was wonderful.
This is a great room of people. And I failed to thank Equal Ground earlier as well. Thank you for pulling together this great event and giving us an opportunity to talk about our legislative priorities and respond to the governor. And thank you to FEA for hosting this. All voting is local action. We already spoke about some of our priorities earlier, but I guess I'll just run through them again really quick, and some of the other ones we didn't mention or that haven't been mentioned yet. One issue that has been increasingly pressing is harassment towards election officials, as more of the misinformation I was talking about earlier seeps into the ecosystem or the media sphere. We're seeing people animated by that, either verbally attacking election officials, or like literally going into their place of work and harassing them and preventing the smooth functioning of elections. So we would like to see some greater protections for them, whether that be privacy for their workers and staff, or harsher penalties for those who commit those crimes, and I do believe they're crimes. I already talked about the check boxes for vote by mail requests, but just again, we think this is a huge problem. It's really nonpartisan. It affects both political parties. It's just something they either need to repeal what they did in 2021 or start incrementally improving the process. Expanding early voting options, that's a no-brainer. It's, again, both parties are using early voting extensively. There's a very clear solution on the table. They need to move forward on it. Several things I didn't talk about were funding or budget related. The Secretary of State has been pushing for funding to repair or refresh the Florida voter registration system. This is the database that underpins all of our election systems. And it hadn't been updated since 2006, I believe. So he's asking a pretty meager amount just to start the process, and we really need, we want to get his back. We want to see state officials support that budget item. Similarly, we'd like to see, well, not similarly, but related to budget items at the local level, we'd like to see greater transparency and maybe some more checks on how local officials are using their money. There were some issues in Orange County this past cycle, and we'd like to see that reformed. I believe Common Cause already spoke to the disaster-affected voter bill of rights. We enthusiastically support that. Again, SB 1486 by Polsky, HB 1317 by Cross. We've already talked about the Voting Rights Act. A few of us have. Again, that's SB 1582 and HB 1409. There actually are bills on the table or that have been filed relating to an eligibility database for returning citizens. We, again, enthusiastically support this. It's SB 848 and HB 489. But let's be real. I mean, a lot of our time in this legislative body is going to be spent defeating or trying to defeat or stop or mitigate bad election bills. Right now, we're tracking 80 bills. At least 8 or 9 have come out in the last week. Some of them close to 200 pages long. Genesis mentioned 414 and 1381. Full of bad things. We're going to oppose anything that creates unnecessary obstacles for voters, anything that requires or even allows the hand counting of ballots by supervisors, anything that expands the size or scope of the Office of Election Crimes and Security, and anything that creates an additional obstacle for voters to use or access the ballot initiative process. Also, any unnecessary ID restrictions. And that's what we're doing. Thanks.
So to bring it back to, access to healthcare and specifically to our reproductive healthcare, I want to be perfectly clear. We will not let up on the abortion ban. We're not going to let politicians lie about it or run away from the issue just because they know they're on the wrong side of it. One thing that I learned from working on the Amendment 4 campaign last year is that when Florida voters understand the impacts, the very serious, dangerous, potentially impacts of the abortion ban here in the state of Florida, they reject the ban. But unfortunately, a simple majority in the state of Florida was not enough. We had the 57% of voters, that's over 6 million people, that voted to end Florida's near total abortion ban, with support spanning across race, background, faith, and political affiliation. This was a bipartisan supported issue. To me, that's a mandate for the lawmakers here in the state. The mandate is that we must repeal the ban. The majority of Floridians believe we deserve the freedom to make personal medical decisions about abortion without the interference of politicians. It's not their jobs to make those choices for us. The current ban is in direct conflict with the wishes, safety, and freedoms of Floridians. And so on behalf of the 57%, we're calling on lawmakers to repeal the extreme abortion ban, which actually bans abortion before many people even realize they're pregnant and has no workable exceptions for rape, incest, and health. Very dangerous. So Florida voters don't want their governor between them and their doctors in the exam room. We want to make our own healthcare decision, and that would start with SB 870, which would repeal the ban, and we support that. We also support making the exceptions in the current ban actually work as they were intended. We've heard stories that demonstrate how the narrow exceptions in our current law are not workable, even for the most extreme medical cases. A woman once told her story about how her baby was not going to survive after birth. but that she also could not access an abortion here in Florida. And so she was forced to continue a grueling, life-threatening pregnancy only to have her baby die in her arms. Absolutely devastating, cannot continue in the state of Florida. And so SB 288 would clarify those exceptions for tragic circumstances when a patient's health or life are in jeopardy, or when patients receive a fatal fetal abnormality diagnosis. We also have to end taxpayer-funded propaganda. Florida taxpayers should not be funding dangerous anti-abortion propaganda. We saw unprecedented opposition to the amendment. We see, Florida pregnancy care networks that receive millions in taxpayer funds just to deceive patients and operate with no medical or safety standards. They jeopardize our medical privacy, and they delay care that people need. Our money, our taxpayer dollars, should instead be going to expanding our access to health care, whether that's contraception, prenatal care, funding rape crisis centers, or really just bettering maternal health outcomes so that we can have healthier families and communities. Thank you.
Thank you to my partners for proposing such dynamic and vibrant positions. Coming at the end, I get to appropriate everything that each of you has already said. So thank you for that. At Florida Rising, we are demanding an agenda that puts people over profit. That means fully funding affordable housing programs like the Sadowski Trust Fund, and ensuring those dollars are used for their intended purpose. Strengthening tenant protections against rent gouging and unfair evictions. Expanding access to home ownership opportunities, particularly for Black and Brown communities historically locked out of generational wealth. And raising wages so that Floridians can afford to live in the state they work hard to build. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. So as we prepare to close, I want to first get a quick poll of our panelists. For those of you who went to public education, let me just see you raise your hand if you had public education at some point. Okay. So with everyone raising their hand, that means that everyone should know how to count. And I'm going to give each of you 22 seconds to close and give a call to action to those of the folks that are listening. And so you've already said that you've gone to public education, you know how to count. And so we want to do a brief closeout, and then I will end with a closing statement. So Pamela, I'll let you start out.
Thank you, everyone. I am extending an invitation to all Florida citizens to show up here at the Florida Capitol. Support yourselves, support your families. Thank you.
And on behalf of the educators in the state of Florida, it is our duty and our obligation to continue to talk to all lawmakers, regardless of which side of the aisle they are on, and call for them to make sure that public education is the priority of this state.
So don't be Adrian Brody is the rule. But yes, so definitely I would encourage all Floridians to stay involved with the process as much as you possibly can. Come to town if you're able. If not, there's plenty of district offices and there's phone numbers and emails you can use. If you're say, well, my voice doesn't matter, the bad bills pass every single year. Well, you should all see how the bills start, because your voice makes a difference, and we do wind up with better products at the end of the legislative session because of the people's involvement in the process. So stay engaged, even if it seems difficult.
Yeah, agreed. The voices matter, both to kill or mitigate the bad bills, but also there are common sense solutions on the table this year for all Floridians, regardless of the party and regardless of where you live in the state. There are good policies that can make our state better that we can advocate for, and your voice matters on those bills too. This is not the art of what is possible this year. This is about a vision for what Florida can be for all of us for years to come.
I'll say people are struggling right now, but Floridians who are immigrants or part of the LGBTQ community are not to blame. For too long, politicians have capitalized on people's concerns about their economic situation by scapegoating people for problems that our leaders have failed to fix, like the housing crisis and rising costs at the grocery store. For over 100 years, the ACLU has worked to defend and promote our constitutional civil rights and civil liberties. We're not going anywhere. Please join us. We're helping build a movement with our great partners here in Florida, and join us.
Sorry, I went to public school, but I don't know how to turn a microphone on. So if you're out there and you're not sure what you can do, there are so many ways that you can get involved. You've heard from all of my fellow advocates here. Join one of our organizations. And of course, since I'm with the League of Women Voters, I'm going to say, please join the League of Women Voters. We're easy to find, lwv.org out there, so join us. But keep involved. I know a lot of people are so weary, particularly after the November election and everything that we've heard since. But keep on trucking, an old term, and I'm showing my age here, but stay involved. Do not use what is happening right now as a way to say to yourself, I'm going to tune out of everything because my voice doesn't matter. Your voice always matters.
I'll just echo that. I mean, I think a lot of people are feeling beat down right now. There's a lot of negativity in the air. You can make a difference. You can impact this process. I think what Trish just said, I'd follow everybody in this room, League of Women Voters, All Voting is Local, Florida Watch, Equal Ground. Equal Ground does an excellent job of watching the legislative process and helping people engage and plug into it. Florida Rising, NAACP, FEA, SPLC, Common Cause, ACLU. I'm going to give everybody a shout out because all of these groups have listservs, email lists, and different ways that you can plug into what they're doing, and that'll help you build the relationships with your lawmakers and approach it in a smart way where you can make a difference. And I'd give a plug for March 26th. There's going to be a rally on the front steps supporting the Florida Voting Rights Act, paying tribute to Geraldine Thompson, a great senator who's kind of an icon in Florida with voting rights at this point. So I think I don't know how many plugs I did, but I guess I did my 22 seconds worth. All right.
So echo everything that everybody has said. You definitely want to connect on the various issues by following. Most of us are on social media, right? And so really from your hand, right, on a smartphone, you can start to learn more about what's happening if you haven't had a chance to plug in yet. But beyond that, I would also invite folks to connect with people in real life. Do you know your neighbor? Do you know their names? The people that live on your street, do you have conversations with them? Do you go to your local park? Do you have engagement and community with folks that you know in real life? Because it starts with community. When we all know each other, when we trust each other, when we have relationships, regardless of party affiliation, regardless of race or gender or immigration status or what have you, we are a lot stronger together, and we don't have to buy into the lies and the political stunts that seek to divide us and keep us from building a life that's better for all of us. So make a new friend. Talk to somebody different.
Thank you. So as we close out, know that our organizations are committed to the fight. We will not stand by as our rights are stripped away. We will organize, we will educate, we will mobilize, and we will defeat harmful bills that impact our community. We will rally at the Capitol. We will pressure lawmakers to ensure that the voices of every Floridian is heard in every committee meeting or in every debate and makes its way to legislation. We can't do it alone, and so we need those of you at home to join us in this fight. The road ahead will not be easy, but history has shown us that when we organize, when we speak truth to power, and when we refuse to back down, we always will win. And so as believers of democracy, we have an obligation that the people's right to change any form of government that does not serve them is always preserved. Thank you. Equal Ground will have our day of action where we're mobilizing